kick off the day. Let me pull up something really quick, and I want to show you. We looked at this yesterday, but this is my version of the syllabus. And I'm going to put a copy of this in that Google Classroom. You can have access to this. It's not some special thing under lock and key. The only difference between yours and mine is it gives me certain notes on certain things that I need to cover and to what extent. And when you're looking at the syllabus, it tells you how many hours we should spend on each topic. Sometimes we give it a little more, sometimes we give it a little less. It just depends on how we're feeling about the topic. But I want to show you, remember, we started with section 3 for us, which is agency, and that correlates with our textbook, which is section 3. But if you look in the syllabus, it's section 7, right? Brokerage relationships, laws, and practice. It's section 7. So please understand, to look at the material and correlate it to the syllabus, you have to look for the terminology, like agency or brokerage or things of that nature. So it may not match up verbatim, but please understand how it correlates. Everybody understand what I'm getting at here? It may not be, 3.1 agency like it is on ours, but brokerage relationships, right? This is correlating with the stuff I'm teaching you now. And I just want to show you really quick as we go through here, right? We've talked about things like agency and principal and client, right? We're talking about these different terminologies. We talked about facilitating and transactional brokerage, so you can see how it correlates. But what I want to show you is when we are talking about forming relationships with people, here's what I'm promising you. When you form a relationship with a buyer, it is called a buyer agency contract or a buyer agency agreement, not a selling agreement. But when you form a relationship with a seller, it is called a listing agreement, which is what I wanted to emphasize with that word. They're not going to be able to, on a test, ever use the word listing in any other context and representation because they would shoot themselves in the foot. If they say that somebody is working with a seller that they don't represent and they say the word listing, then you're going to get the question wrong. They can't do that. It's impossible. Because the way that you form a relationship with a seller is a listing contract. So once you form that relationship, we call you the listing agent. You are listing a home for sale. So, and I mean this, listen to me. You will never see it say such and such is listing for this person and it not mean that they're representing them. I promise you that. They can't. Because it is a listing agreement. That's how you form a relationship with a seller. Does that make sense for everybody? I'm not going to steer you wrong. Buyer agent, right? That tells you a relationship. Listing contract, that tells you a relationship. It's just that word selling that's dangerous. Selling does mean assisting with or working with a buyer, because we do not have a selling agreement. And remember too, you can't sell something unless you have a buyer, right? Travis uses the Best Buy analogy, and I love that. So I will use Travis's information for this. Folks, when you go into Best Buy, if you've ever been into Best Buy, what happens when you're wandering around?
Yeah, help you.
There you go. Best Buy has the most obnoxious customer service that you've ever met in your life, right? You're just standing there looking at a video. They just pop up out of nowhere. They're like, "Can I help you with anything, sir?" Right? Folks, who do those people work for? Best Buy. And they're assisting you trying to do what to you? Trying to get you to buy something, which means they are selling you something, right? You can't be selling unless there's a buyer. So the only word that's dangerous in between listing and selling is selling. Selling means assisting a buyer. Selling means working with a buyer. Okay? Doesn't automatically mean loyalties to the buyer. Listing, you're not going to see it any other way. I promise. Because a listing agreement means you have loyalties to the seller. Does that make sense? I just feel like we went down such this rabbit hole and everybody just got so butthurt about these words. I just wanted to provide this clarity to make you feel better. I'm not steering you wrong. I promise I'm not. You're just not going to see it. They can't. Because listing contract, that's the name of the document we use to form a relationship with the seller. Now, the only thing that I will caution you on is you may see the word seller's agent. Okay? Seller's agent means you're loyal to the seller. Not to be confused with the selling agent, which is working with the buyer. Does that make sense? Because a seller is a person. A selling is an act. Everybody with me? Yeah. No. Seller's agent equals loyal to the seller, right? You gotta listen to this literally. Seller's agent, right? Apostrophe S. That is the agent of the seller. A selling agent is just somebody working with the buyer. Think back to Best Buy. You can't be selling anything unless you have a buyer. So you are in the act of selling when you show a home to a buyer, whether you represent them or not. I'm telling you, the word selling does not tell you loyalties. The word seller's agent, right? By saying agent of the seller. Seller's agent tells you you're loyal to the seller. Listing agent tells you you're loyal to the seller. But the word selling never tells you who you're loyal to. Well, let that sink in for a second. Make sure you don't have any final questions before we bury this thing in a grave, okay? Yeah, ing is just the action. So a seller's agent represents the seller, right? Because it's apostrophe. Seller's agent. If you see seller's agent, we're talking about the agent of the seller. If I say listing agent, I am talking about the agent of the seller. Okay, they're the same thing. Seller's agent, listing agent, same thing. If I say selling agent, that does just mean somebody working with a buyer, which is why I'm telling you the only dangerous word is selling. There you go. Selling is assisting a buyer. It does not discuss loyalties in any way, shape, or form. So if I said that Eric, the seller's agent, is showing a home to Nishaya, a buyer customer. Well, Eric is currently in the act of selling because he's trying to sell it to a buyer. But it said buyer customer. So we know Nishaya is unrepresented and we know Eric's loyalties are to the seller. Pretty good now. Whew, sweet baby Jesus. I never thought one slide would cause so many issues. I'm going to take it out of my presentation, right? I've never used that slide. I was trying to, for consistency, keep the same slides Travis uses. But I'm telling you, I don't like that slide because it causes some issues, right? Yeah. So, and this is what I'm telling you. Do you see anywhere in here that, it says listing versus selling? It doesn't, right? It doesn't say listing versus selling in any way other than these direct relationships. I promise you. That's why that slide, it's not really necessary. It's very necessary to teach you that word selling and how dangerous it is. But it's not necessary to teach you the word listing because that really just comes from talking about a listing agreement. The other thing that I want to point out to you, and this is just so you can take it with a grain of salt. This section right here correlates with a question that Travis and I were having a conversation about yesterday. And he is certain that even though it's on this syllabus, that they're not testing it on the state side. I'm going to teach it to you anyway, because I would rather you have it and not need it than need it and not know it. Okay? So there is one question in the 3.4 quiz, because folks, I'm not going to ask you to do anything that I wouldn't do myself. I've been going through and taking these quizzes. I always retake them before I take the class or teach the class to make sure that I can give you any notes or supplemental information. There's one question in the 3.4 quiz that, legally speaking, the answer choices aren't correct. And that's where Travis said, well, it's going to confuse pre-licensing students. We don't need to go that far. This tells me that we probably do. I'm just going to, like I said, do what you want, right? If you watch Travis's explanation after you watch mine and you want his, go for it. You're not going to hurt my feelings. Best instructor I've ever met in my life. Nobody's perfect though, right? The way he teaches it is based on his experience. The way I teach is based on my experience. Everybody good with that statement? We're both trying to steer in the right direction the best way we possibly can. So, let me get these slides up, pick up where we left off. So we left off in, Brittany, I don't know that one. What does he say?
It's hilarious.
Paraphrase it for me.
I'm getting ready to say, I don't know. I mean, if you played the music, that might.
There's some hoes in this house.
He uses the WAP song.
He uses the ing. There's a couple in the bedroom and they're ing. Do you automatically assume that they are married? It's dangerous to assume they are married. And then he basically says he plays let them pose in the house.
Gotcha. Yeah. But like I said, I would strongly advise you to the ing, think of the selling ing, right? If they're ing, right? That's the dangerous one, and don't assume that they're married. Absolutely. Folks, when we're dealing with agency, and I do love that analogy. I've never actually listened to that one of his. He's got some good ones. When we're actually talking about agency, folks, I told you what agency was yesterday. It's a relationship. And so there's a couple different ways that we're going to talk about a relationship. And that goes hand in hand with what Brittany just said in Travis's analogy. Just because you're doing something with somebody does not mean you have a relationship with somebody. Okay? It is all about who we have a relationship for a lot of these questions. And so it's going to make more sense shortly. We're going to get into great detail today. I promise that you're going to have some more stressful moments, but you're going to have some more eye-opening moments as we get deeper into these agency conversations. So hang tight. For the listing, he plays the Walking Down the Aisle music because he calls it a marriage, right? Because once you are in an agency relationship, he calls it a marriage. So let's go back to agency. Okay, what do we call somebody, right? If we're acting as an agent, what do we call the person that hired us, the person that we're working for?
The client.
Client or?
Principal.
Principal. What do we call everybody else? Customer. Hugely important. Folks, I can't stress this enough. They will sneak the word customer into so many test questions. And they will give you something, right? They're writing up an offer for a buyer. They're showing a home to a buyer. They're sending over the offer to the buyer, for the buyer, right? But what you will have to notice is that it'll say something like, such and such is doing all these things for a buyer customer. And so it's going to give you all these scenarios that make you feel like they're in a relationship. But that one word is strong enough to tell you that there is zero relationship. Client, customer are vastly important words. Those are so important. Those are very strong words. So when we're talking about a client, remember the acronym we gave you yesterday. Old car, obedience, loyalty, disclosure, confidentiality, accounting, reasonable skill, and care. Now, you are seeing all these slides, right? I'm not just like talking and it's not on the screen, right? It's just, okay, just making sure. So when we're dealing with customers versus clients, we owe a client old car always. Always. Right? They've hired us. We're working for them. They're the boss. We owe them old car. Customers, we say we owe them honesty and fairness. Even saying that we owe them honesty and fairness is almost laughable. Because when I told you that we will take customers to the cleaners, I meant it. And that's how I'm going to teach it today. So let's keep going with the client scenario before I get deeper into the customer scenario. I told you yesterday, obedience is following their lawful, willful instructions. They say jump, you say how high. They say put a gun to somebody's head, you say go to hell, right? If it's an illegal instruction, we're not going to follow it. But otherwise, we would. Let me give you a scenario here. If I am an agent endeavoring to get a listing, right, working for a seller, and I go to their house and I start giving them my spiel, and I do something called, and we're going to talk about this later, it's called a CMA, a comparative market analysis, which helps establish a probable sales price for their home. So I sit down and I say, well, Mr. and Mrs. Seller, good news. I've ran the numbers, and I think we could reasonably anticipate selling your home for about $400,000, right? Maybe 400 to 410. And the sellers say something like this: 400, 410, great, excellent. That sounds fantastic. And then they stop you and they say, okay, I think I'd like to list it for 900,000. Well, first and foremost, I'm going to choke a little bit. I'm going to like, what? No. I said 400 to 410. What did you say? 900,000? Is that what you said? I couldn't say it again. Huh? Right? And they're like, yeah, I'd like to list it for $900,000. Let me ask you, folks, am I going to do it?
Yes.
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 If I elect to work with them, I will. Do I have to work with every client I meet? No. Or every potential client? No. But if I elect to work with them, I am. Folks, is there anything illegal about listing a house overpriced?
No.
No. Oh my God, Pamela, you're working out, girl. Oh, look at you. Talking in the style. I heard you. That's awesome. You've been answering questions. I like this, Pamela. You got your voice
Sorry,
back.
I muted myself. It's very sensitive, very sensitive. Sorry about that.
That's beautiful. Yeah.
Me too.
Yeah. Natalia said, wait, what? Folks, listen to me. Is it a good idea to list the house for $900,000? Is it going to sell? Hells to the no, folks. Right? But I told you you have to follow their lawful, willful instructions. Did they tell you to do it, and did it break any laws? Yes and no. So you have to do it. Lawful, willful instructions. Now, let me tell you the real world, folks. If I was to have a client like that, yes, realistically, I would say 900. Okay, here's what we're going to do, Slick. We'll list it at 900,000, and for every week we don't get showings or it doesn't sell, we'll drop it $120,000 until we get back to where we're supposed to be at 410. Does that sound good? Sound good. And then we'll do this fist bump thing, we explode a little bit, and then I sign the listing agreement with them. Please understand, though, right? You have to follow their instructions as long as they're not breaking any rules. Now, let me expand on this. What if after I take this listing, they say, Seth, I really wanted to make $900,000. I didn't think that we were actually going to have to reduce the price. I want you to go out there and put a gun to somebody's head and make them pay $900,000. Folks, too pretty for jail. I'm kind of clumsy. Might drop the soap, okay? Can't risk that. I'm not doing it. Obedience is following their lawful, willful instructions. Now, that is an extreme scenario. But what we come back to is I introduced this concept of material facts that we're going to talk about more today, right? If they tried to stop us from disclosing material facts, we would have to tell them no-go. Because agents, brokers, licensees, right, always have a disclosure of material facts. Always. No ifs, ands, buts, or coconuts. We have to tell the public what we know or reasonably should have known. So when we're dealing with this, a couple often tested examples of clients given instructions that cannot be followed. I've given you a couple. There's one other one that you may not know about yet. And this is North Carolina specific. So in this scenario, sellers often ask their agents to tell buyer B what buyer A offered so that they will beat it. We have a rule in North Carolina under License Law and Commission rule that says you cannot disclose material terms of another offer without permission of, here's that word, of the offeror. So please be very careful. If a scenario, and we're gonna break these rules down later too. But just on that context, please understand that if you have a question that deals with an absolute that says a broker could never disclose the terms of an offeror to another offeror in North Carolina, that's not true. It's not never. Is it probably going to happen? No. But legally speaking, you could with permission of the offeror. It just isn't very likely for that to happen. Does that make sense? So in other words, think about it. Buyer A sends an offer for $400,000. Buyer B sends an offer for $425,000, right? and you want to go back to offer A and be like, well, the offer B put in 425, can you beat it? Well, you would have to go to offer B and say, well, hey, your offer is the best one, but we're trying to screw you. Would you give us permission to tell somebody else what you offered so that we can, take you both to the cleaners? Or they're just going to hang up on you, right? Nobody's going to do that. Why would anybody give you permission? But legally speaking, that's what the rule is written as. If you got permission, you could.
Does it have to be in writing?
It should be, yeah. Here's the thing, some rules state things have to be in writing. Other rules just state that they have to be done. At the end of the day, it's very hard to prove if it wasn't in writing. So in order to stay out of trouble, even if it's not required to be in writing, you should put it in writing. Yeah. So it's just bouncing back. Just bouncing back between the options so you can follow along here. So the next one is loyalty. Okay. Folks, loyalty means they are our people. We are putting their interests first, above our own. This is very important. And we talked about this briefly yesterday. Let me give you a scenario here. If you had a buyer who was interested in 3 homes, and they found these 3 homes on Zillow, and they send them to you as their agent, buyer's agent, right? So your loyalties are to the buyer. And they send them to you. And y'all are always so concerned about commission, but let me just give you some examples here. They send you these 3 homes, and they say, I want to go see these. And one of them is offering you $10,000 as a buyer agent commission. One of them is offering you $15,000 as a buyer agent's commission. And one of them is offering you $100. Do you think that you have the ability to pick and choose which ones you show to them? No. Folks, they are more important than you. We are loyal to them. Their interest comes before our own. So we're not going to not take them to the house that they want to see just because it means we might make less money. Now, let me put your minds at ease here. When we sign a buyer agency agreement, we typically stipulate how much we expect to make. And most often it's a percentage, depending on your area, 2.4, 2.5, 3%, whatever. So please understand that you could have this conversation with the buyer. You can't elect to not take them, but you could say something like this. Well, hey, I'm so excited about these 3 homes we're going to look at later today. Just so you know, remember in our buyer agency agreement, I expected to make 2.4%. Well, house number 3 is only offering $100 in commission, which means that I would expect you to make up the other $9,900. If you're okay with that, let's go see it, no problem, right? You don't have to be a charity. We're not expected to work for free, and your buyer agency agreement would stipulate how much you expect to make. It's just that you can't elect to just not take them there because it's going to be harder to make the money or because you have to have an uncomfortable conversation. Folks, once you say that with them, have that conversation, what do you think they're going to tell you about that 3rd house? I didn't like that one that much anyway. Just go ahead and drop that one off. Let's just look at the other 2. Yeah, that one, you know what? That color just didn't work for me. Actually, I don't even know how that got on the list. Let's just look at the other 2, right? And that's okay. But you are loyal to them. You're not going to do anything that puts your... Folks, some of you wanted to be investors. Great. You can use your license for some benefits for investing. But please understand that you always wear a broker hat. So you cannot go out there and trick the public into selling you their house for cheaper than what it should be sold for. That would be self-dealing. That is illegal in North Carolina. You have loyalties to the people that you end up working with. So the next one, what you got, Patrick?
Sorry, I was a little slow on.
No, you're fine.
I had a question on the preceding slide where you were talking about you can't share information between buyers. I'm just curious how that works with, or how you get situations like bidding wars if there isn't communication.
Because we can say you're not winning, right? We're not giving you terms. But think about it, Patrick. What we typically do is when bidding wars happen, there's multiple offers received. Please send us your best and final is what we say. So people just start throwing money at us, right, in different offers. And so we can come back and say, that we picked this one. Or we can go back to the other people and say, hey, there's somebody beating you that the seller's probably going to take. And they'll say, well, give me another shot at it. We can't tell them what to offer. But we could tell them that the seller is considering another one that, they're probably not going to win because we're not disclosing material terms. The rule is you can't disclose material terms of an offer. You can tell them that they're not currently going to get accepted. Does that make sense? Yeah. And so the problem, Patrick, is here's the thing, and I'll give you some real world stuff here, folks. In the past couple of years, we've had a lot of bidding wars, and we've had a lot of people wanting to buy a house and just paying astronomically higher than the list price. Here's the issue, folks, that you have to realize. Let me get my little pen here. If one offer was, let's just say list price, and one offer was $1,000 over list price, and one offer was $10,000 over list price, and one offer was $100,000 over list price. Let's just say it was just these three offers. Well, I'm pretty sure this offer is going to win. But here's what you have to understand for that buyer. They just paid $90,000 more than they had to get that house. But in North Carolina, there's no way of knowing what you had to pay to win. And so that's where it's always a gamble. How bad do you want to win and how much you're willing to spend, which you're not butthurt if you realize that it was more than you had to. Because you will never know what that gap is. But I'll ask you this question. If you owe these fiduciary duties, by the way, that's what these are called, this old car, these fiduciary duties to clients. Do you think this agent really looked out for their client's best interest? Adult diapers, right? Maybe. If that buyer said, money's no object, I have to have this house, they probably did. If that buyer said, look, I really don't want to pay too much, but I'd be happy if I got this house, they probably didn't, right? And it's always a very fine line that you got to walk between like advice, because we are advisors. And we're going to talk about that more in just a second. But everybody see what I'm getting at? Lisa, oh, okay, you're the one that just raised your hand. Go ahead.
So when we bought our house, I wanted to offer a certain amount of money, and I'm sorry. I'm so sorry.
You dogs, hush your damn back there.
But I wanted to offer about $10,000 less than what the listing price was, but my agent refused to offer it. Was that?
Your agent can't do that. You're the decision maker. In North Carolina, yeah, we're in a fiduciary relationship. Was it a lawful, willful instruction for you to say, I want to offer $10,000 less? Now, could she advise you or he advise you, look, Lisa, it's probably a waste of time. It's probably not going to get accepted. Yeah, but if you say, well, I want to try it anyway, they have to do it.
Yeah, she said that she was like, no, we're not going to offer that because they're gonna get mad and they won't come back with any offer.
That was asinine advice.
Okay.
Because here's the thing. If you offer something like that, we will get into it later. What you may be looking for is what's called a counter offer. And we talked about that briefly when we talked about offer and offeree yesterday. But sometimes when the spread is too far off, they may not come with a counter offer, and it may be insulting. But please understand that there is nothing preventing you from sending them another offer. So even if they don't counter, they say, no, thank you. You could come back with another offer with it's $5,000 less, $2,000 less, $5,000 over. There is nothing stopping you from offering again. Yeah.
And the last thing is, so you have a different contract with the agent. I thought the commission is based on the property that's sold, that the sellers have already put in place a commission structure for that property, and it has nothing to do with the commission.
So that's 100% false, and let me explain briefly. We're going to get there, okay? But here's what you have to understand. Typically, most often, a listing agent is offering compensation to a buyer's agent for bringing a buyer or a seller's subagent. We'll talk about that. But there are some instances where the seller's not offering compensation. The listing agent's not offering compensation. And so there is a buyer agency contract that stipulates what we expect to make. But what it says is, Lisa, we will seek to be compensated by the seller and or the listing firm first, And if they don't compensate us, we may look at you. So there is a default that normally happens, but it's not what has to happen. Yeah. Yeah, you're going to learn all kinds of good stuff, I promise. Let me get back to the next slide, and then I'm going to let you go ahead and take your break, okay? 10:30 to 10:40, you folks go get some more coffee, snackies, stretch a little bit. Wake up, Nashaya. Girls, it's 10:30, right? It's time to be wokes, right? No yawning. You're going to make us all tired. I'm just kidding. I mean, me too. Y'all go take a break. I'll see you back in 10 minutes. So it's funny in the chat, right? We got a lot of people like, I didn't know that. Hey, folks, there's so many things that I'm going to teach you in this class that you either had a misconception about or that you've never heard of. And that's one of the reasons I told you yesterday, this class is so challenging because I have to break you of some things that you thought you knew in order to get questions right on the test. So we're talking about these fiduciary duties that an agent owes a client, right? This acronym, old CAR. And we've done obedience, we've done loyalty, and now we're in disclosure. Now, if you watch any material, sometimes instructors will refer to disclosure as disclosure material facts, those things that I introduced to you yesterday. It's not necessarily that. It's disclosure of everything that your client needs to know, information that could help them make a decision, right? We owe loyalties to them. We need to tell them everything to help them make an educated decision. Let me give you a very normal scenario, and then let me give you a more obscure one. If you are listing a home for sale, working with a seller, you list a home for sale, and they have 10 offers. Better yet, let's just say one offer comes in, okay? One offer comes in, but you have 20 showings, and 20 agents email you after their showings and say, we love the house, we are going to submit an offer, but you've got one in hand. Do you think that the seller needs to know about those other 20 potential offers that may come in order to make the best possible decision on whether they want to take that first one? Yeah. Absolutely. What you got, Eric? You got a question? No, you're just going, okay. Yeah, absolutely, right? Folks, there's a good chance that offer number one isn't the best offer. You got 20 of them suckers about to come in. One of them might be the bee's knees, you know what I'm saying? So yeah, we're going to tell our seller about this. Let me take this a step further. And this is going to be your introduction to the funny relationship. And let me not use that word. The funny thing that is how we work with customers, okay? Customers are those people we have no loyalties to. Well, if you, and I'm not going to teach everything yet, if you go about it the right way and you find out confidential information about a customer, you are obligated to disclose it to your client. Let me explain. If you are the listing agent, okay, Melissa, you are listing a home and I'm a buyer and I call you up. I ain't got no agent, right? And I call Melissa up. We already said yesterday, Melissa can show me the house, yes? Because she's got a relationship with somebody. That somebody's the seller. Well, while she's showing me the house, yes, she's in the act of selling, trying to procure a buyer, right? She's in the act of selling. And what would have to happen in this scenario, folks, if she's showing me a house? She would have already had to disclose to me how agency works. And we're going to talk about that today. It's called the Working with Real Estate Agents Disclosure. So she would have told me a lot of different things and told me that she didn't represent me and that she represents the seller. Everybody good with that statement? Well, after she tells me that, I open my yapper and I say something like, Melissa, I want you to put in an offer for me. And I have $800,000 in the bank and I have to have this house. Melissa, would have to take that information back to her seller because I am a customer and I told her my secrets. She would take it back to the client who she owes loyalties to. She said, we're going to take this fool to the cleaners. This dumb schmuck has $800,000 in the bank and he said he has to have this house. Let's get paid, right? That's part of disclosure. When you find out stuff, albeit the right way, because I haven't taught you the right way, there is certain things that have to happen before you get that information to be able to legally use it. But if you have it, you would have to disclose it to your client. We don't owe customers any kind of confidentiality. But we do owe our clients confidentiality and we do our clients disclosure. Does that make sense for everybody? So anything and everything that can be useful to them in a real estate transaction, including customer confidential information. So when we're talking about disclosure of information, these are just some examples, right? Going off of the stories I told you. All offers, right? Even if they're not actually offers yet. The intention of offers, all offers, no matter what. We have another rule in North Carolina that all offers have to be presented. You don't get to pick and choose as an agent. I'll explain why in a little bit. But any offer that comes in, whether it's good, bad, or ugly, you have to present it. Disclose it to your client. The identity of potential buyers. In some states, it's funny, you don't have to know the identity of potential buyers. But on our offers, we do name the buyers. Relationship brokers have to third parties in a transaction. If your brother wants to put in an offer on a property that you're listing, you'd have to disclose that, right? Because that could be a big conflict of interest. Is any information that could be useful to your client, disclose it, right? And this is where I told you about the customers. Intent of a third party to make profit, terms other than terms the other party might be willing to agree to, right? They offered us $400, but I know they'd go to $450. If you knew that, disclose it. Anything, everything that you know. Everybody with me? What you got, Patrick?
I'm just wondering if this is specific to if your client is the seller versus the buyer.
No. This is specific to your client. Let me give you an example, Patrick. If I am a buyer's agent, my loyalties are to who?
To the buyer.
The buyer. And so if I go and show my buyer a property and the seller comes home before we leave and they are a chatty Cathy and they're just telling us everything about their house and then they let it slip, like I thought my agent listed it too high. I would have been happy with $415,000, right? Well, obviously you're there with your client, but you would be able to use that information, right? To take that to your client. Conversely, what if the listing agent tells you something, right? My seller would be... Now, I'm going to give you a two-part question here. Patrick, if you're a buyer's agent and you call up the listing agent to put in an offer and the listing agent says, well, oh my God, I'm just so excited that you put an offer and that you're putting an offer in. We've had it listed at $450 for forever, and they would be ecstatic with $420. There's two things now that I want you to point out to me. What do you have to do with that information, Patrick, as a buyer's agent?
Take it back and share it with the buyer.
Take it back and share it with the buyer. Well, tell me what you think about that listing agent.
They betrayed the trust, really, of their...
Yes, perfect. They are in breach of their fiduciary duties. They had an obligation of confidentiality and loyalty to their person. If that listing agent shared that information with you, Patrick, can we agree that they violated their fiduciary duties?
Yes.
They're in trouble. You see how this works? It's anybody who's client, right? This is for all clients, buyers, sellers, even property managers, right? Because they're clients too, right? We form a relationship with them. It's not specific on buyer or seller. That's such an excellent question. Everybody understand that? Yeah. So this last note, okay, it says this is why it's so important that people never tell real estate agents / brokers / firms information before they know who the agent / broker / firm is working for. This is one of those epiphanies that if you bought a house, you probably looking back and like, I don't remember my agent telling me how dangerous it was to tell them stuff, right? This is the one thing that I consistently get from people in pre-licensing. My agent never told me that. Why didn't they tell me this? Right? And they may have, they may not have, right? It depends. But folks, the point that I have, not the point, but let me give you a side note. Please don't make pre-licensing a witch hunt. You got enough on your plate to worry about that you've got to get your license. Don't be wondering about what happened 4 years ago when you bought your house, okay? If you want to pursue that after you get your license, go nuts. But I'm just telling you, you got bigger and better fish to fry by getting a license. Lisa, that's an excellent question. Lisa says, do we just take advantage of the info or report them? That's not a question that it's going to appear up on the test, but for the sake of just take advantage of the info. I mean, that is the testable answer. You are going to use the info. But if the test question was, did the listing agent do anything wrong? Know that the answer is absolutely yes. If you want to report them, go nuts, right? Feel free. But at the end of the day, sometimes there are certain things that when we get to like actual license world, I would say, without a doubt, go and report them. But this is not one of them. And let me explain why. Brittany says snitches get stitches. Folks, understand how commercialism works. If you ever go into a grocery store, or hell, let's go Best Buy again, and you see that a computer that you really wanted is on sale, do you get excited? Hell yeah, we like sales, don't we? Okay? Folks, what if it says like, was $14.99, now $12.99? You're like, oh my God, it's on sale, I'm going to buy it. And then you go in 3 weeks later and you see the normal price tag is $12.99. They got you, okay? They just tricked the hell out of you. You thought you got a deal. All they did was make it seem like you got a deal. So the point I'm trying to make here is, what if that was strategy from the listing agent's part? What if they had permission from the seller to disclose to you? That changes everything, doesn't it? Because now you're following their lawful, willful instructions for a marketing strategy. So maybe don't report them just because they gave you that information, because they actually may have just swindled you, right? They had no intentions of getting $450, but they listed it at that, trying to talk you down, getting you at $430. They actually have been happy with $400, but you just paid $430. They got you, right? You see how that works? If your client knows that you're disclosing this information, you're not in trouble. But if it's actually confidential, right? Like, we would take this, but we're really hoping for this. You would never share it. Otherwise, you're in trouble. Yeah. So this piece right here, we're going to talk about in great detail. The thing is, you're all customers. Everybody in the world is a customer until they become a client. Which means every single person we talk to shouldn't be telling us confidential information. Because if they tell it to us, and we never end up representing them, and that information becomes useful, we will use that information to help our clients. Which is why it's a very funny thing to say we owe customers honesty and fairness, when in reality, we will potentially take them to the cleaners if they don't heed our advice to not disclose things to us. Everybody with me? So confidentiality, we just talked about that, right? If you knew that your sellers were going through a nasty divorce and they need to be under contract ASAP, you're not going to tell the public that. If you knew that your sellers would take less than what we've listed out, you're not going to tell the public that, right? Keep their secret. Same thing for your buyer, right? Think back to, I think it was Lisa, right? The buyer wouldn't have put in, her agent wouldn't put in an offer for $10,000 less. Well, what they should have done is put in the offer for $10,000 less, even knowing that Lisa probably would have gone up to full price, but she would have never said that, right? She should have sent the offer, he or she, whoever the agent was, should have sent the offer for $10,000 less with a big smile on their face. Here's our offer. We're so excited to present it to you. We hope you take it. Even though that your agent probably knew that you would go higher. Confidentiality, we keep your secrets. You're our person, right? Yet again, within the scope of the law, there are some secrets we can't keep for you. Material facts. Other things that we'll talk about in a minute, like the inability to convey clear title. Think back to the attorney example that we gave yesterday, right? The person who stabbed somebody, yep, did it, sure did, right? Because they got client, agent, attorney confidentiality. They can't go into the courtroom and tell somebody that you actually murdered, right? You know very well that Johnny Cochran knew everything that OJ did. He was just a really good attorney. Not saying OJ did it, I'm just saying. He knew everything that he did and didn't do. You everybody with me? Yeah, that's exactly right. They can't go to the DA and be like, oh man, this guy's guilty as all get out. Just go ahead. You can't do that. All right? You got loyalties to your person. Now, the accounting, okay? When we say the word accounting, typically it does mean money, but I'll take it a step further. We're going to talk about a lot of different things in this class, like due diligence monies and earnest monies and, things of that nature. So accounting means handling those appropriately, delivering them in a timely manner, having proper documentation of where they've traveled, and then even more so is making sure that we have records, appropriate and accurate records. So you have an obligation to do all this stuff for your client. Proper accounting, all information that needs to be documented. So you've been following along, that was accounting. We got one more left of old car, right? We've done obedience, we've done loyalty, we've done disclosure, we've done confidentiality, accounting. And then the R. What was the R standing for, folks?
Reasonable skill.
That is my favorite, okay? Reasonable skill. Now, there's one more note, but I'm going to skip forward here. This is talking about trust accounts. We're going to spend a lot of time talking about trust accounts later. It says not every agent, broker, firm will have a trust account. So I'm going to circle back. I want to talk about this reasonable skill and care really quick because this is an important one to me. Reasonable skill, oops, too far, and care. I add the care in here. There's a couple things that you have to understand. When we are talking about old car, when I just showed you the syllabus, one of the first things it listed in the syllabus, and I'll actually pull it up for you real quick, on this section, is the rules or laws affecting how we work as brokers. Overview of laws and regulations governing brokerage relationships. Old car is part of what we call the common law of agency. Common law of agency is case law. It is judicial. And it is hundreds of years old. What you got? Do I have a question? Let me explain. Think back to when the US of A was not the US of A that it is today. And people were colonizing from overseas and Britain and England, right? And all these things were happening. And there are lords and kings and queens. And somebody's unmuted, so I'm going to mute you. There we go. They would not be the ones on the boats themselves. They sent people in their stead. Folks, if you send somebody to represent your best interest, what are they to you?
Your agent.
Your agent. They're your agent. And so we may not have formally called them an agent 400 years ago, right? But they were. And so understand that when I say this common law of agency, there is no legislative procedure that's gone through where it went to the House of Representatives and people voted on how agents act. It's people were appointed to work on behalf of others, and they either did well or they did poorly. And if they did poorly, there's a court hearing. And the courts decided, okay, well, did they do this right? Did they do this wrong? So that's what this common law is. It's a precedent set by past court cases. Does that make sense for everybody? So when I give you old car, these are fiduciary duties that you are said to owe in the common law of agency. Well, the reason why they're so interesting is because a lot of the things in the common law of agency, those old car pieces, also mirror, very similarly, some licensed law and commission rules. Well, folks, if you think about it, it makes good sense. The commission has only been around since like 1950 in North Carolina. So, of course, they adopted 100-year-old practices that made good sense that worked with our industry. So, when we go back to the last one, reasonable skill, there is actually a commission rule or a license law, should I say, that deals with prohibited acts. And one of them is you're basically in trouble if you act in a manner as to endanger the public. In other words, just like the common law of agency states, you have to have reasonable skill and care in everything you do. Let me translate this to you the best way I can. Don't be an idiot, okay? If you get a license and you're working the public, you better know what you're doing, slick. Because if you mess up and you cost somebody thousands and not hundreds of thousands of dollars, ooh, bless your heart, you're in trouble. Everybody with me? So I love this one because this is so important. You've got to know what you're doing. It's not enough to just get a license. You got to know how to protect the public. So you need to know how to use the appropriate forms. You need to know when things are delivered. You need to know what the contracts state. All right? Reasonable skill. You got to know what you're doing. I'm going to back up for just a second so I can talk about this other trust account note. Okay? When we're dealing with trust accounts, please understand that, like this says, not every firm has to have a trust account. A trust account is also called an escrow account. And there's a lot of the North Carolina section on trust account because we have a lot of North Carolina trust account rules. But let me explain what a trust account is or an escrow account. It is what we call a custodial account. Custodial is meaning we manage other people's money, not ours. So if you have ever rented a place before and you pay your landlord a tenant security deposit, they have to put that in a trust account because it's technically your money that they're holding on to in case you do something. So when we talk about earnest money is part of a real estate sales transaction, very commonly in North Carolina, and it goes into an escrow account to be held in case something happens. So even if a brokerage or a firm or a licensee doesn't have a trust account, they may be handling monies and delivering them to an agent that has a trust account, typically the attorney, handling the closing. Everybody good with that? We're going to talk about trust accounts in ample detail. I just wanted to make sure that you were all aware of what this was kind of getting at here. These two terminologies were the only other thing I want to add to this piece before we talk about them down the road. These are two highly illegal things that you would do if you were managing a trust account, meaning don't do them, but you could accidentally do them and get in big trouble. Conversion is using somebody else's money, as is in a trust account, to pay for things, okay? Using clients' money from the trust account for personal or firm purposes. You pay your light bill from a trust account, that's conversion. You pay your dues with a trust account, that's conversion, right? Using that money to pay for something personal or firm related. That's called conversion. Commingling is mixing your money with other people's money. That's not allowed either. The general rule is you have to have less than $100 of your own money in a trust account. And the only reason you have that money there is for bank fees, right? So your money can pay for bank fees and, transfer fees, management fees, whatever. If you ever have more than $100 in there, you have to regularly remove it so it's not commingling. Okay, those are two very important terminologies for trust accounts, also called escrow accounts. We're going to talk about them in great detail because, like I said, the North Carolina test loves trust account questions because they got a slew of trust account rules. So this little note right here goes with this reasonable skill. It says practicing in areas of real estate without knowledge violates the trust of your client. Let me give you an example here. When you get your license, your broker's license, right? Because that's what you're all endeavoring to get. Your broker's license in North Carolina, real estate broker's license. Your license is good for the entire state of North Kakalaki. Some of you are in Fayetteville. Some of you are in Charlotte. Some of you are in, the coast. Some of you are in Raleigh. Well, good news is you can use your license in whatever area you are in. But let me explain something to you. There are nuances in markets. And so just because you can do something doesn't mean you should. Because I've been in the triangle market for the 7 years I've been a real estate broker. If I went and endeavored to help somebody buy a house at the beach, I could legally. But are there some things that I might not know, like CAMA, the Coastal Area Management Act, like floodplains, like structural requirements for stilts or things of that nature, right? So if I go into that area, I better make damn sure that I know what I'm doing. Because you can't just be like, well, I have a license, it's okay. No, it's not. If you do anything to endanger the public, you're in trouble. Same thing. Your license that you get can be used for property management, it can be used for general brokerage, and it can be used for commercial. There's no different license for those. There's different skill sets though. So you would not want to take on a commercial transaction without experience. Everybody with me? There you go, Britt. Working within the realm of your expertise. Absolutely. What do you know? How comfortable are you? Can you protect the client? That's a question you should always ask. What you got, Eric?
So you said that, well, you're talking about that, but aren't there, I know that like, the license covers everything, but aren't there separate classes you can take for like commercial real estate?
Absolutely.
And stuff like that.
And that's skills, right? It's not a separate license, but it is separate skills that you would have to gain in order to tackle something like that. Absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah. Makita says, when I moved to Greenville, I had a Raleigh agent try to help me, and it was awful because she didn't know the area. But when I got a Greenville agent, it was much better. Absolutely. Folks, even something where there's probably not too much differentiation in rules and regulations, there's a big difference in area knowledge, right? Where's the closest this? Where's the closest that? What's the up and coming area where my home values are typically going to appreciate versus, the areas where we might not want to be? There is a difference. And that's the question you always have to ask yourself. Can I accurately and adequately represent my client to the fullest and not put them in danger? And the answer is yes. Do it to it, prove it. And the answer is no. You might want to refer it out, Hojo. Get in trouble. So this is just supplementing on these, right? Sometimes we have so many slides, and I'm not going to spend as much time on them because it just beats them into the ground sometimes. Principal or client has the right to rely on their agent broker firm to provide a reasonable estimate of the market value of the property. Now I want to stop for a second because here's another thing where I'm going to make a deviation from what you're seeing on your slide. This is a very dangerous word, value. And the reason is only an appraiser can use that word. When we get into the valuations chapter, when we are talking about real estate brokers doing a CMA or a BPO, right, which is a comparative market analysis or a broker price opinion, the only thing that we could state is a probable sales price. So I just wanted to give you that visual or that mental note. When you're dealing with a test question and it says, which of the following is an agent establishing when they do a CMA? And it says, value of the property or probable sales price. It's probable sales price. Brokers can never give opinions of value. Only an appraiser can do that. Everybody with me? Yes, absolutely, Beth. The commingling conversion slide again. Give me 2 seconds. Let me just back it up here. Oop. Sometimes you get a little click happy. I apologize. Here we go. You just get a clicker in your hand and everything goes out the window, You just... Which I have to clarify, this is a clicker, right? I had one student ask me if it was a vape pen. I'm like, no, it's not a vape pen. It's a presentation clicker. But I guess the problem is sometimes when I'm talking to you, I'll just sit it right here. I get it. It's a clicker. Good deal. So that value is a dangerous word as well, right? I like to point out these dangerous words because they can be a make or break on a test question. All right. So reasonable estimate of a probable sales price of a property is a better way to say that. They deserve our knowledge and opinion about fair pricing. Absolutely. Right? Not value, but probable sales price, what it should sell for. Never make an offer to purchase one of your own listings without being very clear to the seller about the true value of the property. This goes back to that no self-dealing. I told you, even if you become an investor, you can't take advantage of people. Could you buy a seller client's property? Yeah. If you disclose what it actually should be sold for and you get it in writing that they're fine with it. And then the recommendation in a lot of cases is to actually sever your listing agreement and make sure that they know that they could hire somebody else to represent them, if you're going to endeavor to purchase it. That's some deep-rooted interpretation stuff. Make sure that as a licensee, you are always honest with clients about the value of their property. Once again, not value, because we don't give them value, but probable sales price, what we could sell it for. And then to not do this would be considered a breach of duties. Absolutely, right? We've got to know what we're doing. We've got to know what we're talking about. We've got to do it accurately. Eric, value is determined by an appraisal, right? Only an appraiser can do an appraisal. And only an appraisal is an opinion of value. Brokers do CMAs, which is a comparative market analysis, which states probable sales price. Brokers can also do what's called a BPO, which for legal purposes is the same definition as a CMA. This stands for broker price opinion, and we're going to talk about those more in the valuations chapter. But both of those from a broker gives a probable sales price, never a value. Lisa, Zillow can help with pricing? Absolutely not. No. Never, ever, ever. When we are doing, we're going to get into this down the road, but there are a lot of tools that the general public use that are not acceptable for us as professionals. And so when we're doing a CMA, we're looking at past sales. Can you look at past sales in Zillow? Sure. But Zestimates are not accurate, and you also can't see everything in Zillow. There's a whole section that only agents, only brokers can see that don't get to Zillow. You can only see them in the MLS. Yeah. So another piece of this reasonable skill, it says advise your principal or your client about offers and how they should respond to them. Folks, what does that word advise mean?
Agent be giving advice.
Yeah, give them some information, give them what you think they should do. But when you are an advisor, who is ultimately the decision maker?
All right. The client.
Your client. Your client. We don't make decisions. We advise them. They are the decision makers, right? Think back to the agent scenario, right? The other examples. Tom Cruise's agent recommends that he should take 20 million or 200 million for, Top Gun 2. Tom Cruise says, hell no, I'm not doing it, right? He makes a decision. Tom Cruise had to decide that he wanted to make Top Gun 2, right? We're advisors. So we are as agents. They're the decision makers. They hire us. They're the boss. They're the decision makers. But we're the advisors. We're the professionals. What you got, Eric?
Yeah, so I was just wondering, going back to that previous slide, it says make sure that as a licensee you're always honest with clients about the value of their property. So if you were to do a CMA, all right, you get one price and then later on it appraises at a different price, like would you get in trouble because it appraised at a different price?
The short answer is no, because CMAs and appraisals do not always match up. Understand that we as real estate licensees love to throw appraisers under the bus. Oh, that appraiser doesn't know what they're talking about. That's the stupidest appraisal I've ever seen in my life. But here's what you have to understand, folks. In order to get your broker's license, you have to sit through 75 hours, a little more, with me or Travis or somebody like us. You have to pass a test, and then you can go play real estate. It's over 200 hours of class for an appraiser, and they have to be an apprentice for 2 years before they can go solo. So it's actually kind of laughable when we think we know better than an appraiser. But the short answer is, Eric, sometimes they don't match up. As long as you did your CMA in a competent and accurate way and your numbers make sense, you're not in trouble just because the appraiser found different numbers. But if your CMA is wonky, stupid, you pulled terrible comps, you did it very poorly, you're in trouble. Yeah. 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 Let me just make sure. I think y'all are really comfortable with this concept because we haven't had any crazy conversations here. when we're looking at any test question, I told you the most important thing to understand, especially on agency questions or relationship, is who do we have a relationship with? Because old car is something we owe to clients, but it is never something we owe to customers. So that's where when you're looking at a question, you've got to determine who the relationship is with. And you do that with those other words like customer or client, like agent or not, right? You got to be very careful with the verbiage to determine the relationship. And then that will tell you how to answer the question. Because if Guillermo tells his seller client that the buyer is willing to pay more than the offer that he's received, Guillermo did exactly what he was supposed to. If Guillermo told the buyer's agent that his sellers would take less than what was listed, it was listed for, Guillermo breached his fiduciary duties to his clients. You see how that changes? You've got to understand who the relationship is with, and then what happened in the scenario to answer the question appropriately. Now, so let's get into section 3.2 of these agency topics. Okay, disclosure of information in sales transactions. So I keep using the term disclosure and working with real estate disclosure. So we're going to get into some information on that disclosure, the material facts disclosure, some of these mini lessons that I've given you so far. Okay, so when we're talking about, let's just say, general disclosures, right, of information. Let's start here. There are a couple different ways that disclosure can happen. And I'm not talking about a specific disclosure form yet. I'm just talking about certain disclosures, right? So we could have disclosure of information from a licensee to their client, which goes back to old car, right? Anything that we know, right? That disclosure of the old car. Disclosure of information from sellers to buyers. Okay, so no, we're not talking about an agent there. We're talking about somebody selling property, somebody buying property. And the disclosure of information from licensees to their customers. Notice the big difference here. This is talking about someone we have a relationship with, and this is talking to somebody we don't have a relationship with. Okay? There are disclosures that have to happen in all of these relationships. Certain ones. So let's start with the middle one. Disclosure of information from sellers to buyers. It's going to pop up in the slides, I'm sure, but I like to just talk about things for a second and make sure that you're following along with me. In North Carolina, we have what is called the Residential Property Disclosure Act. The Residential Property Disclosure Act. And this act is an actual North Carolina law that was adopted to ensure that certain obligations were met by the seller to the buyer. And let me tell you the real reason why. It's because of something called the doctrine of caveat emptor. The doctrine of caveat emptor is Latin, I believe, and it translates to let the buyer beware. So some states have disclosure laws that state that every seller has to disclose any defects that they know that's wrong with their property. North Carolina does not. North Carolina is a doctrine of caveat emptor state, which means the seller does not have to disclose any defects with their property. Hence the name, let the buyer beware. Because we don't have the sellers any obligation to actually disclose stuff, one of the ways that we decided to mitigate this, to assist with this doctrine, because it's an older doctrine that we just never got rid of, is we created the Residential Property Disclosure Act. But let me make something abundantly clear. When we're talking about the Residential Property Disclosure Act, all it does is require 2 forms in most transactions to be given to the buyer prior to them submitting an offer. I'm going to say that again. All it does is require that 2 separate forms be given to the buyer prior to the buyer submitting an offer. Well, the first form is called the Residential Property and Owners Association Disclosure Statement. It's a mouthful. So I told you we love our acronyms in real estate. We call it the RPOADS. 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 Residential Property and Owners Association Disclosure Statement. RPOADS. Right here. All right. RPOADS. And so this form is mandatory in residential sales in North Carolina, except for a few exemptions. Now, before I even talk about the exemptions, I want you to know that the form is mandatory, but the disclosures are not. When you look at the form, a seller has 3 answer choices to every question. They can answer a question yes, they can answer a question no, or they can answer a question no representation. Folks, you ever seen Chappelle's Show back in the day? Oh, it's good stuff. One of my favorite. The skit where he's talking about pleading the 5th, right? The right to not self-incriminate. He's like, I plead the 5th. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5th. Not gonna tell you anything, 5th. Slap it on the table, 5th. You don't have to self-incriminate. So that's why they have this option of no representation. So when we look at this form in a second, they can say, well, let me give you an example. The question will say, is there any defect, malfunction, or otherwise with the roof, this foundation, or yada, yada, yada. And their options are, yes, there's an issue, no, there's not an issue, or no representation, which means I'm not telling you nothing, you figure it out. So the form itself is mandatory, but they would in theory have the right to say no representation to every single answer on the form. Now that being said, do you think this RPOADS is a very useful piece of paper to actually determine if there's anything wrong with the property in North Carolina? Arguably not, right? Arguably not.
Useless.
Potentially useless. Most people do fill it out accurately and completely, but yeah, potentially useless. So the form is mandatory in most transactions, not all, right? Disclosures on the forms. The answers to the questions are optional, but the form itself is not in most transactions. Shelby says, but if the seller tells the agent has to disclose the info because it's material facts. Absolutely. That is a very important thing to understand. So let me give you a scenario here. When we look at it, if the question was, is there any problem with the roof? Well, and the seller told their agent, yes, my roof leaks. This seller still has every right to put no representation on that disclosure. But please understand that that doesn't change the agent's obligation to disclose it to the world, because it would be a material fact. The doctrine of caveat emptor applies to the relationship between sellers and buyers only, not us. Licensees, we always have to disclose everything that we know or reasonably should have known. Everybody good with that statement?
I think you alluded to it yesterday, but I guess that's an argument for having an agent, both the buyer and the seller having an agent.
Absolutely.
So I got a question too.
Okay.
So in real world situation, you're sitting down, you're listing a property with your client, and you're going through this form, or they're filling it out with you, and you're going like line by line, and they start telling you all these problems. then you would just say, well, don't say no representation, just fill it out, because you already know that you have the obligation to disclose it, so might as well just do it then and there and up front, or how else would you disclose it?
Conrad, that's an excellent question. Let me explain something to you folks, just so we're on the same page here. That is a great question, but you know what that is? That is a real world question. If I was in the real world, absolutely, I agree with you, Conrad. I would tell the sellers, I'm like, look, I know it. Now I have to tell the world, you might as well be honest on this thing, and let's just try to work through it, as opposed to me saying it, but you not, right? There's no point. But please understand, from a pre-licensing point of view, they're not going to ask about best practices. They're going to deal with the rules, the policies, and what you have to do. So if they say, you're going to get test questions like, the seller has put no representation on there, but you know that the roof leaks. What they're looking for is that you know you still have an obligation to disclose regardless of how that they answered. But you're absolutely right. From a real world point of view, I would just say, look, I'm going to have to tell everybody, you might as well tell them too. Does that make sense? Excellent question. Lisa, can we tell them they can use no rep or help guide through the disclosure? Well, here's the thing. This is theirs to fill out. Can you assist in answering questions if they're confused? Yes, but understand it is very important that the seller is the one filling this out. We can't fill it out for them, and we're not going to tell them what to put on there. So we could guide them through it, and if they want to put no rep, they can. If they don't have to. We're not going to tell them what they should or shouldn't put on this. Does that make sense? Guillermo says, reason why the buyer needs a good home inspector. Absolutely. 10,000-fold. No, we can't help them with that to say on the, yeah, what to say on disclosure. Gene, what do you mean? Clarification of questions, correct? You mean that's what we can work with them on? Like understanding the questions better?
On the form itself, I'm
yes.
not really sure where
Perfectly said. Yep. Absolutely right. That's what we can do. Because some of these questions, when you look at them, they are convoluted as all get out. Even question 1 says, is there any problem or defect with the dwelling's roof, foundation, substructures? It's like 32 things long. And so helping them comprehend the questions a little bit better is something we can do. But at the end of the day, they're filling it out how they see fit. Just understand that regardless of how they fill it out does not change our obligations of disclosure. This is only between the seller and the buyer. Doesn't change anything for us. So here's where you have to understand that there's some things that you haven't seen and some things that you don't know. So Lisa says, then where do we admit that they have disclosed to us? We don't care. Somewhere. You could tell them on the phone, a buyer calls you and says, hey, I've got a buyer client interested in putting an offer on this property. You would have to say, hey, just to let you know, the roof leaks. You've done your job. Now, yet again, is it better to do it in writing? Yes. So what you don't see in the MLS, which is the multiple listing service, is a section called agent remarks. Only other licensees in that MLS can see those remarks. That's the best place, Lisa. So I would put, please be aware that the roof leaks on this home. Seller elected to put no representation, but it does leak, right? That way it's in writing, it's tangible, they've seen it, you've done your job, you've disclosed it. But the rule doesn't state it has to be here, it has to be there. The rule states it has to be disclosed. But from a protection point of view, writing is easier to prove that you actually disclosed it. Nelsie says, is this form supposed to be given 3 days of buyer submitting an offer? Hang tight on that. There is a magical 3-day thing, but it's not that verbatim. So I'm going to bench that for a second, which is an excellent segue, and we're going to talk about it. Last question. Barry says, will the seller directly provide to the buyer? So let's hang tight. Okay, y'all ask brilliant questions, but I promise some of these are going to get answered if you just hang with me for a second, right? Introducing these brand new concepts. So when we're dealing with the RPODs, let's start with the exemptions first, and then I will answer these other questions you have. When we're dealing with a residential property, understand this is called the Residential Property Disclosure Act. So let me explain what is a residential property. A place that you intend to live in that is a single family home up to a quadruplex. Okay? Single family detached is residential. Duplex is residential. Triplex residential. Right? Condo residential. All of these would be residential, right? 1 to 4 units. If you are purchasing a 5-plex or anything bigger, that's considered commercial. It's exempt because it's not considered a residential property. That's really how we break it down. 1 to 4 units is residential. Anything different than that is defaults to commercial. Does that statement make sense? So even if you were selling a quadruplex, the seller would have to provide this. The other exemptions for the RPODs is foreclosure sales. Now, you don't know, you think you know what a foreclosure is, but you may not know exactly what it is, but that's coming down the road. But a foreclosure is exempt. That's when the bank is forcing the sale of your property. They don't have to provide you an RPODs in a foreclosure. New construction. Folks, you have to understand that the intention of this is to potentially have a vessel to disclose defects. Well, arguably, new construction shouldn't have defects. Does it? Yes. But arguably, it shouldn't. So that is an exemption. New construction is exempt from providing the RPODs. And then properties being sold by an estate or a trust, any court-ordered exchange, or a transfer between co-owners, all of these are exempt. There's one more exemption, and I don't think they're going to test you on it, but just in case, I'm going to tell it to you. A lease with option to purchase, where the lessee already occupies the property. Picture it. If Thais lives in my home, and we have this agreement that she can buy it at the end of her 1-year lease if she wants to. Okay? Well, she lives there. She knows what's wrong with the property, doesn't she? So that's an exemption. A lease with option to purchase where the lessee already occupies the property. They're already living there. By the way, Melissa, you are exceptionally bundled up. That coat looks warm. It's cold out there? Yeah. I'm expecting you to be in like Russia. Like, I don't know why. Like, that coat just makes me think. Like, I'm just expecting you to pull out a bottle of vodka, right? And just be in Russia, hanging out, eating some, you know, borscht or pierogies or something, you know? Like, I don't. No, you just look very Russian in that coat. Like, it's yeah. So, here's where we're going to get into the question. We can drink vodka for class. No, CJ, no vodka. I told you, no drinking for the next 6 weeks. Too many brain cells lost, right? You need all them brain cells. Yeah, it does look like water. You're right. Although, Brett, I tell you what, you can take a sip of vodka without flinching. We might need to go to a meeting, okay? We just might do. I know it depends on the vodka, right? Some vodka's better than others, okay? But, yeah, there you go. So, yeah, so does Patron. It's true. Tito's is smooth. There are some. You're right. There are some, right? You could, like, Melissa just grabbed her water bottle. It's water. All right. Yeah. So, here's where we'll get into that 3 days that you were trying to talk about. Long Island's will get you, Douglas. That's exactly right. Watch some brain cells, Douglas. I told you, you need them. You need them. Conrad. In case anybody needs to talk about it, right? We'll put that link in the Google Classroom too. So when we're dealing with these, I told you it is an obligation that when it's not exempt, the seller has to provide these. So here's the first answer. The seller's not handing them to the buyer directly. In some cases, the buyer and seller will never even talk, never meet, never even know each other, right? That's normal. So what the Residential Property Disclosure Act states is that it is every broker's obligation to facilitate these to the buyer. So the listing agent needs to provide them to the seller. Seller needs to fill them out. Listing agent needs to provide them to the buyer's agent. Buyer's agent needs to provide them to the buyer. Does that make sense? Every agent's responsibility to facilitate getting these to the buyer. You're talking about Long Islands? Long Islands are delicious. Don't you come after Long Islands like that. I'm with you, Douglas, right? Sometimes you just need a little zip in your drink, right? Just sometimes a Jack and Coke ain't enough. You need 6 liquors and 1 tall glass to get your day going. Yeah, there you go. I'm with you, Douglas. Don't let these people come at you. Matt drink. That Matt drink is a disgusting concept, but Long Islands are delicious. I digress. I know what an LIT really is, Brittany. I used to bartend too. Unless you're making them wrong, girl, it's just 5 to 6 different liquors, some sour mix, and a splash of Coke or Diet Coke, depending on who makes them. And they're delicious. They get you turned. How you have a grand old time, right? Start off the night with some Long Island iced teas. Before you know it, you're going to be in jail. I'm sorry, wait. No. So, every agent's responsibility to facilitate getting these to the buyers. Now, here's the thing. Buyers are supposed to receive the seller's disclosure form prior to making an offer on the property. So, what the 3 days you're talking about, let me explain this. The Residential Property Disclosure Act says that this is so important that they've built in kind of like an out. Okay? If the buyer puts in an offer on the property and they have not received this disclosure form yet, well, it is still possible for you to go under contract. And so 3 days comes into play in 2 ways. If you go under contract and you've not received these disclosures, you have the right to terminate your contract with no penalties within 3 days of the effective date of your contract, if you never received these. The other time 3 days comes into play is, folks, understand that sometimes when you send an offer, and we're going to talk about this later, you send an offer that you want to turn into a contract. Well, it's not a contract until it actually turns into a contract. So the other time that 3 days comes into play is if you send an offer over and they send you a copy of the disclosures, the clock starts counting. So you've got 3 days from the date you either received the disclosures or 3 days from the date that you formed a contract without receiving the disclosures to terminate a contract with no penalties. That's where 3 days comes into play. Does that make sense? Now, you may not understand the word penalties yet because we haven't looked at a sales contract. So you may not know what the penalties are typically for terminating. So we'll talk about that later. That's a later conversation.
So you still have 3 days to cancel your contract with the form?
If you received it before you submitted the offer. So let me just give you the example, Tiffany, because this is going to come up later. If you were to send somebody an offer, let's say, I'm just going to put offer, okay, an O, on, what's today's date? January 8th. Well, let's say that they also sent you a copy, because you didn't have a copy yet. They sent you a copy of the RPODs on January 8th after you sent that offer in. Understand that it is possible for you to not actually go under contract until January 10th. Now, here's the thing. You've had the disclosures for 2 days now, and you just got under contract. Now you only have 1 day left to get out of that contract before that 3 day period is up, because it is 3 days from the effective date, meaning the date that it went from an offer to a contract, if you haven't received the disclosures, or 3 days from the date you received the disclosures. And since they sent you the disclosures the day you sent the offer in, but then you went under contract 2 days later, that 3 day clock started whenever they sent you the RPODs. Does that make sense? Yeah. So it's funny because sometimes y'all ask really good questions, and sometimes I take for granted that there's certain things that you won't know unless I explain them to you. And so this is a beautiful question. Khadijah says, how do we know an offer is about to be made to provide them with the form, or is it when they're inquiring? It goes back to the multiple listing service again. There is a document section within the multiple listing service. So we actually just upload these in the real world. we upload these to the MLS, and so they're available to every potential buyer's agent, right? And then that way, when we look at the offer to purchase and contract, the form that they sign, there's a place where they check the box, yes, I've received them, no, I haven't. And that tells us if they've gotten them or not. And then they actually are asked to sign a copy acknowledging that they've received them. So yeah, sometimes people miss them in the MLS, and so we would have to send them to them directly. That's an excellent question. Anne says, would a buyer be able to get their due diligence or earnest money back in these instances? Absolutely. And that's what I meant by the penalties. You have none. If you're within this 3-day period, there's no penalties. You would get both back. But some of you don't know exactly what we're talking about yet, so that will be covered later, I promise. Natalia says, so you cover your money sign a bit if you put these things in agent remarks, but then still have to put it in the disclosure once deal seems to be moving forward. Let me ask you to chime in. Give me some more clarity on what you mean by putting the disclosure, because I want to make sure that I tell you accurately, because I'm not.
So pretty much, like the whole thing with the dates, the 1/8, and you don't know when the offer's gonna come in. So I'm assuming you put the stuff, you do as much as you can up front. You put it in the remarks, whatever you want to put in the remarks. And it's like all these offers come in, let's say, right, on the 8th. So at the point where all the offers come in, you present them to the client that you're working with, and they like, okay, I'm gonna let's pick A. So then you only send the RPOs to A.
No, everybody would have already had a copy of the RPOs before they submitted that offer. So that's what I'm saying. In the from a real world point of view, Natalia, when I meet with a seller, I hand them these forms and I say, fill them out. And then as soon as we start marketing their property, I upload them for the world to see in the MLS. Every buyer gets these, even if they're not going to put an offer, right? Because they have to have them before they put an offer. So it's not just I'm only giving them to one person. They're not private, right? We'll disseminate them to the public, right? We do this very early on.
I got it. So
it's
beforehand. It's nothing like you have to kind of like the dates. Okay.
Yep.
Is it the seller agent's responsibility, though, to ensure that the buyer agent and or buyer has seen them?
That's an excellent question, Patrick. Let me expand on this a little bit more, because this is where we start getting into there's so many details about one topic kind of area. And so let me tell you one thing first before I answer that question. The Residential Property Disclosure Act is not specific to licensees, meaning if you are a for sale by owner, you are still expected to provide these forms to a buyer. So when it comes down to, the listing agent versus the buyer's agent, understand this. The rule states that it is every agent's responsibility to facilitate getting it to the buyer. So if I'm a listing agent, what does that typically look like for me? I upload them after my seller fills them out into the MLS, and they're there for the buyer's agent to then give to their buyer. Well, Patrick, did you know there's some morons out there in this world we live in? Sure there is, right? Bless their hearts. So when a buyer's agent, who might be one of those M words, right, puts in an offer on my property that I'm listing for my seller client, and they check the boxes that say, I have not received them. Here's what I'm going to say, right? I'm going to say, oh, sweetness, we can't accept this offer because I put the RPOs and the other form that I'm going to talk about in just a second in the MLS. I need you to download them, sign them, update your offer that you've received them, and then send the offer back to me acknowledging that you've received them. Does that make sense? Yeah.
Thank you.
Yep, absolutely. Lisa, hold your horses, girl. I'm going to teach you the second form. Ooh. I'm just going to leave that teaser up there like that. I'm going to tell you the second form, girl. I just got to get through the first one first. Okay? So we already said this. We're never answering the questions for them. We can help them understand the questions. And I told you, this is required whether they're using a broker or not. Okay, so we're still talking about the RPOs, right? Part of the Residential Property Disclosure Act. So We already said this. Buyers should be provided the disclosure before they make the offer on the property. And then this goes into that 3 days, right? So for you visual people, here's that, right? They have 3 days to terminate any contract that is formed and get a refund of any deposits or fees paid when they went under contract. 3 days from the effective date of the contract, or 3 days from the date they received the disclosures, whichever occurs first is what it quite literally says. I will tell you, if you pull up the actual RPODES itself, it also says unless the buyer takes possession or occupies the property or closes, right? Meaning, if you were to move into the house the day you go under contract, you've thrown out that 3 day period. You're not allowed to then just turn around and back out with the 3 days. So if you were to move in the property with an early possession, or if you were to close on the property, that would extinguish that 3 day period. It's tossed out the window. Shelby says, is it fair to say as an agent, we won't list our client's home until they fill it out and submit it? No, because sometimes we can start marketing a property and we give these to the sellers, and sellers drag their butts on getting these to us. So we can still have a listing agreement in place. We can still be marketing their property. We can still have buyers showing the property, but we definitely need that done from the seller to give to the buyer before anybody sends an offer to us. Does that make sense?
Yes, thank you.
Absolutely. Excellent question.
Thank you.
Ooh, and that is such a good question too. Y'all ask the best questions. I love y'all already. Y'all ask some good ones, right? And says, how does this impact a listing that is sold as is? I'm going to go ahead and give you an epiphany to appreciate, okay? In North Carolina, we most commonly utilize a sales contract called an offer to purchasing contract form 2T. And we'll talk about down the road. It's not the only one you can use. It's just the most common one we use. And what that form states is that every home that is sold using that form is sold in its then current condition. What does that mean? As is. So when somebody says as is, what are they saying? And they're saying, I don't intend to make any repairs. That's what they're saying. But please understand that whether or not they intend to make any repairs does not change their obligation under the Residential Property Disclosure Act. And whether or not our sellers are willing to make repairs does not change our obligations under material facts disclosure. Ever. Excellent question. Well, Erica says, so it's basically getting the RPODES completed ASAP as an incentive to get your house sold faster. Yeah, it's basically an incentive for the seller. Get this done so we can accept an offer without having to worry about them having the right to terminate. Because can we accept an offer from a buyer who has never received this? Yes. But they would have what? 3 days to terminate the contract with no penalties. You don't want that as a seller, right? That's a very dangerous position to be in. You take your house off the market, you think you have your house sold, on day 2 they back out with no penalties, all because you didn't give them one form. Now please understand that everything we're talking about right now, this Residential Property Disclosure Act, this is a North Carolina specific concept. You will not see this on your national test, okay? You will not. That's why we got this little North Carolina flag here. It's in the name, the North Carolina Residential Property Disclosure Act. And Britt, you're absolutely right. New construction does not use it. So, let me show you what this looks like. And I'll probably just pull up the actual form maybe when we get back from lunch because it's about 12 minutes away. Here's where the questions start. There's a whole blip of instructions that you're not seeing, but here's where the questions start. So, I always say question 1. It's really question 2. So, it's a little grainy here, but let me read this to you. Is there any problem, malfunction, or defect with the dwelling's foundation, slab, fireplaces, chimneys, floors, windows, including storm windows and screens, doors, ceilings, interior and exterior walls, attached garage, patio, deck, or other structural components, including any modification to them? Folks, that one question is a doozy. So that's where we said you could help your client interpret it, help them understand it. But they are always the ones that have to fill it out. And like I told you, they can say, yes, there's an issue. Or they can say, no, there's no issue. Or they can say, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. All right, I'm not telling you nothing. All right, figure it out, slick. I plead the 5th. No representation. They're not saying yes, they're not saying no. They're saying, I'm not telling you. What you got, Ann?
I guess I feel like you alluded to how loaded the question is, but it can also be interpreted, in my opinion, a little bit subjectively. For example, I don't remember how the sellers from whom I purchased my house, I don't recall how they filled this out, but my house was built in 1930. And so, obviously, of course, like, there are problems.
Yes.
So it's kind of like, how do you define that? And I guess I'm wondering, as an agent, what is the appropriate level of quote unquote skill or, my duty to my client in terms of how to advise them what is considered a problem?
And y'all really do ask the best questions. I mean that. So y'all are asking fantastic questions. So let me expand on this, because Ann is absolutely right. She bought a home from the 1930s, and she's saying there's probably some subjective nature, right, in the eyes of the beholder kind of thing when answering these questions. So the first thing you have to understand is, your question was, well, what level of expertise do we have to have? And I'm going to help you out here. For most of this stuff, none. I'm going to tell you the most exciting thing that you will hear as an aspiring real estate broker. You're supposed to be a professional on helping people buy and sell homes, nothing else. In other words, you're not a home inspector. You're not a structural engineer. You're not a pest inspector. You're not a roof inspector, right? You're none of those things, and you're not expected to be. So you're not giving them any advice on how to answer this. But to expand on the question further, and when you look back on the first page of this, it says, and I quote, "to the best of the seller's knowledge." If you say, no, there's no issue, you're not promising there's no issue. You're saying, I don't know of one. Right? So just like you, we're not expecting the seller to pretend to be a structural engineer or a home inspector or anything like that. If they know of an issue, they need to tell you what they would tell you what they know if they elect to. But they can say no if they don't know, right? Here's the thing that they can't do, though. They can't lie. So if a seller knows that their roof leaks, or better yet, let's just start with question one. The foundation has issues. And they come in here and they say, no. They have committed fraud. And they're in trouble. Because that's lying. Understand the difference here. It's either, yes, I do know, no, I have no knowledge of, or I'm not telling. And if you know that there's an issue and you come in here and say, no, you have committed fraud as a seller. And a buyer could sue you for fraud. Okay? So when it comes to the agent, we don't have any, we just help them interpret the questions. We're not helping them determine if there's an issue or not. Excellent question. Does that make sense? Yeah. Lisa, what if she visually sees the floor slope, but the client does not mention it? Well, number one, it depends on who the client is. You're talking about an agent sees that the floor is sloped, but your seller client doesn't mention it? Disclose it. Could that be a material fact? Lisa, could the fact that the floor is sloped change the outlook of somebody to purchase a home? Yeah. Seller has zero obligation to disclose anything under the doctrine of caveat emptor. They can't try to hide defects, and they can't lie. But they don't have to tell you anything that's wrong. So if your seller client never makes any mention about their sloped floors or sagging foundation, but you have a reasonable suspicion to believe that there is a sloped floor, sagging foundation, or other issue, you still have an obligation to disclose that to the public. Yeah. Now, you may want to inquire, right? At that point, you say, well, hey, Mr. and Mrs. Seller, it seems to me that this floor is sloped. Do you know of any foundation issues or sagging piers or anything that we should be aware of? And if they give you information, then you can utilize that information to provide to the public, disseminate to the public. But if they say, well, now that you mention it, I've never even thought about it. We've never had any issues that I know of. Whether they have any issues doesn't change the fact that you may have an obligation to disclose. Does that make sense? So the question here is, what if the owner had knowledge, selected no, and lied? How does that affect the agent status, and does it fall under if we should have reasonably known? Adult diapers. Okay? If you walk into, let me take this a step further, and we're going to really break this down after lunch when we get into what we call misrepresentations and omissions. If you walk through a house and you see a water stain on the ceiling, and you ask the seller, well, hey, is that recent? Is that old? What's that from? And they say something to the effect of, oh, there was an old roof leak, but it's been fixed. We just never fixed the drywall. And you go and you state that to the public with absolute certainty. It is not an issue anymore. Stop asking me. And a buyer buys the home and it's still actively leaking. You're in trouble. You should never disseminate information that you cannot verify. At that point, what would be your best practice? The seller said it's fixed. I'm not so sure. You need to evaluate it. We're not expecting you to say, yes, it's an issue. But if you preach, no, it's not an issue, like it's gospel truth, even though you don't know, you could be in trouble as the agent. But if you say, hey, there's a water stain, I have no idea to what extent, and that's all you say, and then the seller lies, the seller's in trouble and you're not, right? All you know is what you know. Does that make sense? You're not psychic. You can't say, yes, it's still active, no, it's not. But do not take unreliable sources as gospel truth. You can say, and the textbook doesn't like this, but what you would say is, the seller says it's this, I'm not so sure. Because there's really no way for you to verify unless you have somebody who's a professional come out and investigate it, which we're not obligated to do. Shelby, I would err on the side of caution. Can you suggest to the seller to slap some paint on it? Yes, you can. But if you're suggesting them to slap some paint on it and it's not actually a resolved issue, that's covering up an issue, and that's fraud.
So if the seller said, oh yeah, we just had that roof fixed, we just haven't had the painter come back yet, he's been busy, blah, 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 is that something where you can say, you probably need to get your painter back out?
Yeah, if they can show you, once again, if they show you the roof reports and the contract and the estimates where it's been fixed and it's a non-issue and it's been dried out and there's nothing, can you paint stuff like that? Sure. I'm just going to say it. Somebody said it in the chat. When in doubt, though, disclose. You just don't want to get yourself in trouble. Because if they just say that it's been fixed and you have no verifiable evidence, I would disclose it, If they've got reports that say it's been fixed and then they paint it and you know that there was a spot there and it was just discoloration that's now been painted, technically, things that have been resolved that are one-offs are not a material fact. Once it's been fixed, we don't consider it material fact anymore. Recurring issues, even when fixed, are considered material fact. But one-offs, fixed, repaired, remediated, not a material fact. Does that make sense?
It does. Thank you, Seth.
Absolutely. Tiffany says, so do we as agents get an inspector before listing? We'll talk more about that later. It's entirely up to the seller. Folks, you should never be an ostrich, okay? And by that, I mean, don't stick your hand in the sand and pretend you don't see or hear anything, right? That's more likely to get you in trouble. You can't be like, no, I don't know anything, okay? You have an obligation to discover information, not to the extent that we have to have home inspections. What we reasonably should have known with visual inspection. When we get into material facts, it'll make more sense, I promise. You're asking amazing questions, but it's coming up. It's going to get there. That being said, folks, you've made it to lunchtime. I'm excited for you, right? Go on and have yourself a lovely lunch break. Remember, if you can help it, stay logged in. Just turn your screen off. 12:45, right? 12 o'clock, 12:45. Have a lovely lunch break. We'll see you back in 45 minutes.